1 week, that's all it took. Not a scandal that built slowly over months, not a career-long reputation finally catching up to someone, just 7 days of decisions made in the heat of competition that somehow managed to unravel something it took years to build. There's a shoe deal worth serious money that's suddenly sitting on the edge of a cliff, and the athlete watching it teeter didn't see it coming until it was already too late to pull it back from the ledge. 2 names are at the center of this story, and the way they ended up tangled together in the same headline is one of the stranger things to come out of professional basketball this year. One player is fighting to hold on to something. The other didn't even ask to be part of the conversation. And yet here they both are, and only one of them looks good right now. To understand how far things have fallen, you first have to understand where Dijonai Carrington actually was before any of this started. Because she wasn't some fringe player hanging onto a roster spot by her fingernails, hoping a brand might eventually notice her. She was somebody Reebok looked at and decided was worth investing in, worth putting on a contract, worth building a marketing campaign around, worth attaching their name to in front of millions of people. That doesn't happen by accident. Brands with real money to spend don't hand endorsement deals out randomly. They study athletes carefully, they look at personality, they look at social presence, they look at how a player carries themselves in interviews and on the court, and then they make a calculated bet that this person is going to make customers feel something positive when they see their face associated with a product. Reebok made that bet on Carrington because on paper there was a genuine case for it. She had a personality that came through on camera. She was vocal, she was expressive, she wasn't the kind of player who gave boring one-line answers in press conferences and disappeared into the background. She played with energy that translated well to highlights and short clips, which is exactly the kind of thing brands are chasing in an era where social media attention is the most valuable currency in sports marketing. You don't just need a player who can score anymore. You need a player who can hold a viewer's attention for 15 seconds on a phone screen while they're scrolling. And Carrington had that quality in a way that made the deal make sense when Reebok first signed it. She also came into this season with legitimate momentum behind her. When she returned to the Chicago Sky's lineup, the team was actually playing well. They were putting up points, stringing wins together, and the conversation around her was starting to shift back toward basketball in the best possible way. A player finding her footing, a team building something, a season that looked like it had genuine potential. That's the kind of storyline a brand loves to attach itself to because it gives you content, it gives you emotion, and it gives you a narrative that customers can actually get behind when they see it in an advertisement. The thing about endorsement deals that most people outside the industry don't fully appreciate is how much of the value has nothing to do with performance statistics. A brand isn't writing a check because your points per game average went up. They're writing it because of the feeling your name creates in someone's head when they're standing in a store deciding which shoe to pick up off the shelf. That feeling is built slowly, through years of showing up consistently, handling yourself well in public moments, and making people feel like they want to root for you rather than against you. It's genuinely hard to build. It takes time, and it takes a lot of moments going right. And it can be damaged a lot faster than most athletes realize until they're already watching it happen in real time. That's the part of this story that makes it genuinely painful to look at from the outside, regardless of where you stand on any of the specific incidents that came later. Carrington had real equity built up. She had a deal, she had a platform, she had an audience that was at least partly on her side and willing to stay there as long as the season kept going in the right direction. None of that is nothing. For a player in a league where salaries are still a fraction of what the men's game pays at the top level, an endorsement deal with a brand like Reebok represents something significant, not just in terms of money, though the money matters enormously, but in terms of visibility, legitimacy, and long-term career building that extends beyond any single season. There were also genuine signs that the wider basketball audience was starting to pay more attention to the WNBA as a whole this season, which meant more eyes on every game, more cameras rolling at every moment, and more opportunity for players to either build their brands or damage them in front of an audience that had never been this large before. That growth was supposed to be a rising tide that lifted everybody. More viewers means more brand interest means more deals, and more deals means more financial security for players across the entire league. Carrington was in a position to benefit from all of that. She had a head start on the kind of mainstream recognition that most players in this league spend entire careers chasing without ever quite reaching it. And then the week happened, and everything that had been building in the right direction started moving in the exact opposite one instead. Not gradually, not quietly, but fast and publicly, and in front of the largest audience the league had seen in years. The worst possible combination of timing and decisions, stacked on top of each other in a way that left very little room for damage control once it was already in motion. There's a version of this where one hard foul in a physical basketball game gets forgotten by breakfast the next morning. Analysts mention it, a few clips get shared, maybe a broadcaster raises an eyebrow on the replay, and then the news cycle moves on because there's always another game the following night that needs covering. That's how most of these moments go. The league is physical, contact happens, and nobody has the bandwidth to turn every flagrant foul into a week-long national conversation. Most of the time, the story just doesn't have enough legs to run that far. This one had legs because it wasn't one foul. It was three separate incidents, all of them involving the same player on the receiving end, all of them happening within the span of a single week, and all of them getting filmed from multiple angles by cameras that were broadcasting to an audience that had grown substantially compared to where it was even 12 months earlier. When you put those pieces together, the story stops being about one bad moment in a competitive game and starts being about something that is much harder to explain away with a shrug and a comment about how physical the league is. The one that got the most attention, and the one that ultimately triggered everything that followed, was the flagrant 2 foul on Sophie Cunningham. The details matter here because they're what made the play so difficult to defend publicly. Cunningham was going for a fast break layup, which means she was moving toward the basket, fully committed to the shot, in the kind of vulnerable position where she couldn't protect herself from contact she didn't see coming. What happened next was described by multiple broadcasters in real time as a wind-up followed by a follow-through. Not an accidental bump, not a player reaching for the ball and making contact by mistake, but something that looked deliberate enough that the word excessive got used on air before the refs had even finished reviewing the play on the monitor. The call was a flagrant 2. That classification matters because of what it actually means in terms of how the rules define it. A flagrant 2 isn't just a hard foul. It's contact that is deemed excessive, and that carries with it a real potential for injury. Referees don't hand those out liberally. They review the footage, they confer, and they make a judgment that what they watched crossed a specific line that separates competitive physicality from something that genuinely endangers the player on the receiving end. Carrington was ejected immediately after the ruling came down, and within minutes, the footage was already being shared across every major platform simultaneously. But that wasn't the only incident being talked about. There was a second play that caught nearly as much attention, and in some ways the reaction to it was even more visceral than the reaction to the flagrant foul. During a separate moment in what was an already charged stretch of games, cameras caught what appeared to be Carrington raising both hands in a motion that looked like a defensive gesture or an "I didn't do anything" pose, while simultaneously making contact with a player's face in a way that didn't look accidental from any of the available angles. Commentators watching the footage in real time could be heard questioning what exactly they were looking at. People who analyzed the clip frame by frame on social media pointed out that one hand appeared to be going for the ball, while the other was making contact with the opponent's eye area in a way that was hard to categorize as anything other than deliberate. That specific clip spread extremely fast because it was the kind of moment that looks different the more times you watch it. On first viewing, you might think you misread it. On second viewing, you start to question what you thought. By the third time you've gone through it slowly, the questions pile up in a way that doesn't lead anywhere comfortable. And that's exactly the kind of content that gets shared, reshared, stitched into reaction videos, and kept alive for days on platforms that reward controversy with engagement. Then there was the third incident, folded into the same stretch of games, adding one more layer to a pattern that was already forming clearly enough for almost everyone watching to see it. By the time analysts started running down the list, 3 fouls in 1 week against the same opponent stopped sounding like a coincidence and started sounding like something that deserved a harder conversation than what was happening on sports talk radio. Physical basketball is not the problem here. Nobody covering this story seriously was arguing that the WNBA needs to become a no-contact league or that competitive edge is something players should leave in the locker room. Toughness, aggression, and the willingness to guard someone hard are all part of what makes the game worth watching. The line that most people pointed to in this case wasn't between soft and tough. It was between tough and reckless, between playing with intensity and playing in a way that puts another person's safety in genuine question in front of a camera that catches everything. And what came directly after the fouls made every single one of them harder to set aside than they would have been on their own. Because the plays themselves were only the first half of the story that week. Here's the thing about a controversial foul in a professional basketball game, even a bad one, even an ejection-worthy one that gets replayed 100 times before midnight. Most of the time, the player at the center of it stays quiet, lets their representative handle the initial wave of questions, and shows back up to the next practice without adding any more fuel to a fire that would naturally start dying down on its own within 24 to 48 hours. That's the playbook. It's boring, it's calculated, and it almost always works because the news cycle has a short memory when nothing new gets added to the story. Carrington did not follow the playbook. While the game was still being played, not after it ended, not the following morning in a controlled press conference setting, but during the actual game, while she was sitting in the locker room after the ejection, she posted from her phone. And the word she used was white privilege. Just that, dropped into a public post at the exact moment when millions of people were already discussing her ejection and looking for any additional detail that would give them something new to react to. The timing could not have been more combustible if someone had planned it to be. Now, whether that comment was directed specifically at the foul, at the ejection call, at some broader frustration she was feeling in that moment, or at something else entirely, that's where things got complicated fast. Because she never clarified. Not in the immediate aftermath, not in the days that followed, not in any of the statements or interviews that came after the story had already grown well beyond the basketball court it started on. When reporters asked her directly what she meant by it, the response she gave was that she wasn't specifically talking about the foul call, which, on one level, is her right to say. But it raised an obvious follow-up question that she also didn't answer clearly. If not the foul, then what? That absence of a clear explanation created a vacuum, and vacuums in viral news stories get filled immediately by whatever interpretation is loudest at the time. Commentators, analysts, fans, and media personalities all started filling in the blank based on the context they had in front of them, which was a clip of her fouling a white player, getting ejected, walking off the court, and posting 2 words that carry enormous weight in any public conversation. The gap between what she said and what she was willing to explain became the story itself, and it ran a lot longer than the foul ever would have on its own. Analysts who covered it broke down the communication failure in pretty blunt terms. The argument that came up most consistently was that vague public statements in situations like this don't protect you, they expose you. When you leave that much space for interpretation, you don't get to control which interpretation wins. The one that spreads fastest is the one that sticks, and the one that spread fastest here was not charitable to her position. Multiple commentators pointed out that a simple, honest acknowledgement of frustration in the moment, something along the lines of admitting she was emotional after the ejection, and that the post wasn't well thought out, would have likely generated far more public sympathy than anything that came out of the way she actually handled it. Instead, the double down happened. Rather than taking the off-ramp that was clearly available in the early hours of the story, she held her position without offering any real additional context. And every time a reporter or commentator pushed for more clarity and didn't get it, the story got a second wind that kept it going another news cycle. That's the mechanism that turned a one-day basketball story into a week-long conversation that eventually reached the offices of people at Reebok who had nothing to do with fouls, nothing to do with ejections, and nothing to do with anything that happened on the court, but who had a very significant interest in whether the athlete wearing their brand's name was someone the public wanted to associate with. The white privilege comment also brought in voices from well outside the usual sports media sphere. Political commentators, social media personalities with large audiences who had never tweeted about WNBA basketball before in their lives, and several prominent figures who used the moment as a jumping-off point for much broader arguments about race, sports, and accountability. Once the story crossed that line from sports coverage into cultural commentary, the audience watching it grew by an order of magnitude almost overnight. That kind of attention is not the kind any brand wants attached to their logo unless they're actively choosing to take a public political stance. And Reebok has not historically been a brand that courts that kind of controversy. What made the comment particularly damaging from a pure optics standpoint was the contrast it created. One player fouled. One player posted. One player stayed quiet and kept playing. That simple three-part sequence told a story that millions of people who had never watched a single WNBA game before could understand immediately just from 30 seconds of context. And the player who stayed quiet, kept playing, and said very little publicly was not Carrington. The contrast between the two sides of this story was sharp enough that it almost didn't need anyone to explain it. It explained itself. Social media has a specific way of handling sports controversies that brands have learned to watch very carefully over the last several years. In the early days of Twitter and Instagram, a bad moment from an athlete might generate some angry comments for a day or two before the algorithm moved everyone on to the next outrage. That's not really how it works anymore. The tools people have for organizing frustration, amplifying specific clips, and turning individual moments into coordinated pressure campaigns have gotten significantly more powerful. And the Carrington story landed directly in the middle of all of them at full speed. The first wave of reaction was exactly what you'd expect. Clips of the Cunningham foul going viral, reaction videos from sports commentators racking up millions of views within hours, highlight accounts stitching together multiple angles of the same play so viewers could see it from every possible direction simultaneously. That stuff is standard now for any controversial play in any major sport, and on its own, it probably wouldn't have been enough to escalate things to the level they reached. The second wave is where the story changed shape into something brands genuinely dread. Once the white privilege comment circulated alongside the foul footage, the conversation shifted from "that was a bad foul" to "this says something bigger about this player and what she represents." That shift matters enormously for brands because a bad foul is a sports story. A bad foul combined with a charged public comment is a cultural story, and cultural stories attract a much wider and angrier audience than anything confined to sports coverage. People who cared deeply about the specific phrase she used started sharing the story to audiences that had nothing to do with the WNBA. And each share brought in a fresh wave of people discovering the story for the first time and forming an immediate opinion. The tweet that got the most traction in those early days put it in terms that were impossible to misread. The gist of it was direct. Reebok still has this athlete on an endorsement deal after the foul and the comment, and if they don't drop her, customers will drop Reebok. That's not a subtle message. That's an ultimatum delivered publicly to a brand's social media presence, where every employee, every executive, and every shareholder can see it being amplified in real time. The quote tweets underneath it weren't just agreements, they were people adding their own receipts. Old clips resurfacing. Screenshots of past comments being dug up and recirculated. Earlier incidents from previous seasons being stitched together into a broader argument that this wasn't an isolated bad week, but a pattern with a longer history. That compilation effect is one of the most dangerous things that can happen to an athlete's public image in the current media environment. Each individual piece of footage or screenshot, taken alone, might be dismissible. One clip, one comment, one bad night, those are things a PR team can work around with the right statement and a few weeks of quiet. But when people start gathering them together into one organized case and presenting them as evidence of something systemic rather than accidental, the whole becomes significantly larger than the sum of its parts. And that assembled case started being shared by accounts with very large followings who were not regular WNBA viewers, but who were very motivated by the specific cultural conversation this story had entered. The boycott language started appearing within the first 24 hours and didn't stop. People explicitly stating they would stop purchasing Reebok products as long as Carrington remained on the sponsored roster. Not vague dissatisfaction, specific, actionable consumer threat language directed at a specific brand decision. Marketing departments track this kind of sentiment closely, because the difference between someone venting online and someone who actually stops buying your product is a line that's easy to cross in both directions depending on how a brand responds publicly. Ignore it long enough and some percentage of the people making that threat will follow through. React too quickly, and you risk looking like you're caving to mob pressure, which creates its own set of problems with a different segment of your audience. For Reebok, the math became uncomfortable fast. The people calling for Carrington's removal were loud, organized, and growing. The people publicly defending her and threatening to buy more Reebok products in solidarity were significantly quieter and smaller in number. That asymmetry is the thing that actually moves brand decisions more than any single viral tweet. It's not just the noise, it's the direction the noise is pointing and how many people are willing to act on it with their wallets rather than just their keyboards. Old incidents also came back into focus during this period in ways that added additional context the story didn't previously have for most casual observers. Earlier moments from Carrington's history in the league, incidents involving other players, old comments that resurfaced with fresh eyes on them, got absorbed into the current narrative and made the argument for a pattern feel more credible to people who hadn't been following her career closely. Every time something new got added to the pile, the story got another day of life and another round of pressure directed at Reebok's social media team. By the end of the first week, the internal question at Reebok had reportedly shifted from whether to address the situation to how quickly they could do it without creating an entirely different controversy in the process. And that's when a specific name started appearing in the reports about who might be next in line. The name that started circulating as a potential Reebok replacement wasn't pulled out of nowhere. It made a specific kind of sense that went well beyond simple irony, even though the irony was hard to miss. The player reportedly being floated as Carrington's replacement on the Reebok-endorsed roster was Sophie Cunningham, the exact same player who had absorbed the flagrant foul, the eye contact, and every other moment of physical controversy that started this entire chain of events in the first place. If someone had written this as fiction, an editor would probably tell them it was a little too neat. But sports has a way of producing storylines that fiction wouldn't dare attempt. Reports suggesting Reebok was quietly exploring a transition away from Carrington started appearing across sports media and social commentary channels during the same week the boycott pressure was building. The timing was not coincidental. These things rarely are. Brands monitor public sentiment in near real time now, and when the volume of negative association with an athlete's name reaches a certain threshold across enough platforms simultaneously, internal conversations that might have stayed theoretical for months suddenly become urgent. The reporting described the situation as Reebok quietly looking at cutting ties, which is the specific kind of corporate language that means a decision hasn't been finalized yet, but the direction is becoming increasingly clear to everyone in the room. What made Cunningham's name the one being attached to the speculation rather than some other athlete entirely is worth examining, because it's not just about the obvious narrative connection. Cunningham had been building her own public profile throughout this season in a way that had brands paying attention before any of this drama started. She plays with a physicality and confidence that translates well to marketing material. She handles herself in front of cameras with a composure that makes press appearances easy, and she had developed a following that went beyond her existing fan base into wider sports culture, particularly after this week, during which her name had been in more headlines than at any previous point in her career. The wrinkle in the Cunningham replacement story was the Adidas situation. She already had her own footwear arrangement developing with Adidas, and in the normal structure of these deals, that would make her an essentially unavailable candidate for a Reebok partnership. Brands in the athletic footwear space are competitors, and signing an athlete away from a competitor's deal is complicated enough on its own without the added layer of an athlete who is simultaneously building a signature shoe project with someone else. These things usually don't work together because they aren't supposed to. But according to what was being reported, Reebok was allegedly willing to structure something creative enough to get around that obstacle. The details that circulated suggested the brand was open to an arrangement where Cunningham could maintain her Adidas footwear situation while still coming into the Reebok fold in some broader capacity. Perhaps apparel, perhaps a limited collaboration, perhaps some other structure that allowed both relationships to coexist without direct conflict. The specifics were vague, which is typical for deals being negotiated before anything is formally announced. But the willingness to even explore that kind of unconventional arrangement said something significant about the level of urgency on Reebok's side. When a brand starts bending the rules they normally operate by, the unwritten conventions about exclusivity, competitive separation, and how endorsement portfolios are typically structured, it generally means the situation they're trying to fix has gotten uncomfortable enough that standard solutions aren't moving fast enough. A company that was comfortable with its current roster and confident in the direction its brand was heading would not start improvising deals that require working around a competitor's existing arrangement with the same athlete. That's the kind of flexibility that only appears when someone in a decision-making position has decided that the cost of moving slowly is higher than the cost of getting creative. For Carrington, the Cunningham replacement angle added a layer to the story that went beyond the financial implications of losing one deal. There's something uniquely damaging about the narrative of being replaced specifically by the person you fouled, not just any athlete the brand might pivot toward, but that athlete, the one whose name has been in every single headline alongside yours for the past week. Whether or not the deal ultimately happens exactly as described in the reports, the story of Reebok considering it is already public, and public perception of that story is almost as powerful as the reality of whatever decision eventually gets made behind closed doors. It also changed what the story meant for Cunningham. She had been the quiet, composed side of a two-player headline, the one absorbing the contact and saying very little publicly about any of it. Now her name was being attached to something that looked like a reward for that composure, a brand moving in her direction, precisely because of how she handled a week that could have easily pulled her into the same mud as everything else swirling around it. That contrast between the player losing a deal and the player potentially gaining one was not lost on any of the audiences watching this story develop. And it set up the next part of the conversation, which was about what these deals actually contain in their fine print and why the situation was potentially even more serious for Carrington than most people outside the business side of sports had realized yet. Most fans who follow professional sports know that athletes lose endorsement deals sometimes. It happens, it gets reported, and unless it involves a massive name or an extremely dramatic set of circumstances, it usually generates a day or two of coverage before everyone moves on. What gets discussed a lot less frequently is the specific legal and contractual architecture that makes those removals possible. The language built into these agreements that gives brands the ability to exit cleanly when things go sideways in a public way. Understanding that architecture is what makes the Carrington situation look significantly more serious than a simple sponsorship dispute. The clause that matters most here is what the industry refers to as a morality clause, or morals clause, language embedded in virtually every major endorsement contract that gives the brand a defined exit if the athlete engages in behavior that damages their image or the brand's image in a material way. These clauses exist because brands are not just buying athletic performance when they sign these deals. They're buying association, and association is only valuable if it creates positive feelings rather than negative ones in the mind of the average consumer. When the public perception of an athlete shifts sharply enough in a negative direction, the morals clause is the mechanism that allows a brand to act on that shift without having to wait out the remainder of a multi-year contract while the situation gets worse. What makes a morals clause get triggered is not always a dramatic criminal accusation or a single catastrophic event. The language in most of these agreements is deliberately broad, because brands need flexibility to respond to situations that their legal teams couldn't have predicted when the contract was signed. Patterns of behavior, repeated public controversies, and sustained negative media coverage are all things that can fall within the scope of what these clauses cover. Which is exactly why 3 incidents in 1 week, combined with a public comment that generated its own separate wave of controversy, creates a genuinely complicated situation for Carrington's position on Reebok's roster. The people commenting publicly on this from a legal and business perspective have pointed out that the combination of factors here is more problematic than any single element would be on its own. One flagrant foul, standing alone, is unlikely to trigger a morals clause. One controversial social media post, standing alone, probably doesn't get there either. But 3 fouls involving the same player, a public statement that generated a week-long cultural controversy, a viral boycott campaign threatening the brand's sales, and the subsequent media coverage tying all of it together into one ongoing story. That combination starts looking a lot more like the kind of sustained reputational situation a morals clause was designed to address. The financial stakes extend beyond Reebok specifically, which is the part of this story that doesn't get discussed loudly enough in most of the coverage. Endorsement deals exist in an ecosystem where brands watch each other. When one company distances itself from an athlete due to behavioral concerns, other brands currently considering that athlete for future partnerships start recalculating their own risk. Brands that were in early conversations about potential deals quietly close those conversations without ever making a public statement about why. Opportunities that might have materialized over the next year or 2 simply don't. Not because anyone announces they're backing away, but because the athlete's name now carries a risk premium that makes the math stop working for the marketing budget. For a player in the WNBA, where base salaries, while improving, are still a fraction of what the men's game offers at every level, endorsement income isn't supplementary. For the players who manage to secure meaningful brand partnerships, that money can be the primary driver of total annual earnings. Losing one deal is painful. Losing the pipeline of future deals because one difficult week made you a harder sell to risk-averse marketing departments is a much larger and longer-lasting financial consequence than the immediate contract cancellation. That's the quiet version of the damage that doesn't show up in any single headline, but that players who have been through similar situations understand well. Carrington's attempt to walk things back, the softer statements, the suggestions that the comment wasn't about what most people assumed it was about, the appeals to let the basketball speak for itself, arrived too late to change the shape of the story that had already formed. By the time the clarifications started appearing, the narrative had calcified across enough platforms and enough audiences that a measured statement wasn't going to dislodge it. The window for a clean exit from the controversy had been open briefly in the first hours after the ejection, and it closed before the backtrack was ready. That timing problem is not recoverable through PR alone. What made the situation particularly uncomfortable to watch from the outside is the awareness that all of it was avoidable. Not the foul itself necessarily. Contact happens in physical sports, and not all of it is calculated, but the chain of decisions that followed. The post from the locker room during an active game. The refusal to offer a clear explanation that might have diffused the comment's most damaging interpretations. The double down when a simple acknowledgement of frustration would have generated significantly more grace from an audience that was still on the fence about how to feel. Each one of those decisions was a door that could have closed the story, and each one opened it wider instead. That's the part of the week that brands remember long after the specific details of the fouls have faded from the public conversation. There's a specific kind of power in staying quiet when everything around you is loud. It's not passive, and it's not easy, particularly when you're the person who absorbed the contact, whose name is in every headline, and whose side of the story is being told by everyone except you. But composure in those moments creates something that no amount of public statements or social media activity can manufacture, which is the impression that you are the person in the story who doesn't need to win the argument because the facts are already doing it for you. That's essentially the position Sophie Cunningham has been in throughout every day of this story. And it's worth examining what she actually did, and didn't do, during a week when she had every reason to be publicly vocal about what happened to her. She kept playing. That's the simplest version of it. After the foul, after the ejection, after the social media firestorm that attached her name to a controversy she didn't create and didn't ask to be part of, she showed back up, laced up her shoes, and played basketball. She gave measured responses when reporters asked questions, acknowledging the foul happened, not escalating the language around it, not feeding the parts of the story that were already running hot on their own. She specifically mentioned that she herself had been ejected in the past for a similar type of foul and deserved it, which is a remarkably self-aware thing to say publicly, when the current narrative would have supported a much more aggressive take from her without anyone raising an eyebrow. That kind of comment is significant because it demonstrates a level of credibility that's hard to fake. Players who respond to controversial fouls by immediately claiming victimhood and attacking the person who fouled them are easy to dismiss as self-interested. A player who acknowledges complexity, who brings their own accountability into the conversation, even when they're clearly on the favorable side of the public perception divide. That player reads as honest in a way that audiences reward and brands actively seek out. It's not a calculated image play so much as it is a reflection of how someone actually carries themselves, and the cameras caught it at exactly the right moment. The visual contrast between the two sides of this story is what made it so easy for millions of casual observers to form an opinion quickly, even without knowing anything about either player's history or career. You don't need WNBA expertise to understand the image of one player absorbing a hard foul and then getting back up and playing, versus one player throwing the foul, getting ejected, posting from the locker room, and spending the rest of the week in a public argument about what she meant by a two-word social media post. Those two pictures sit right next to each other in every piece of coverage this story generated, and the contrast does its own storytelling without needing any narration. For brands evaluating both players right now, that contrast is almost the entire conversation. Brands are not in the business of picking winners in moral debates or assigning fault in athletic disputes. What they are in the business of is finding people whose public image will make customers feel good about a purchase. That's it. The whole enterprise reduces to that one question when you strip away the marketing language and the campaign strategies. Will seeing this person's face make someone more likely or less likely to pull out their wallet? Right now, with the current state of public perception around both players, the answer to that question for Cunningham is different than the answer for Carrington. And brands make decisions based on that difference even when they never say it publicly in those exact terms. Cunningham also benefits from a growing fan base that has been expanding rapidly this season for reasons that existed well before any of this week's controversy. She plays with a physicality and confidence that resonates with audiences who appreciate a specific kind of competitor. Someone who brings energy without drama, who competes hard without making the story about themselves when things get difficult. That combination of qualities is genuinely rare, and it's the kind of thing that makes a player marketable in contexts beyond their sport, the broader lifestyle and cultural conversations where the most valuable endorsement deals actually live. The irony in all of this, if you step back far enough to see the shape of it, is that Cunningham's profile grew in direct proportion to the controversy that was supposed to be primarily about someone else. Every headline that mentioned her name, even in the context of being on the receiving end of a foul, introduced her to audiences who had never heard of her before. Every clip of her handling the situation with composure expanded her perceived character in a direction that brands find appealing. She didn't engineer any of it. She didn't need to. The story created the platform, and she showed up to it exactly the right way. Whether or not the Reebok situation plays out as the reports suggest, the underlying dynamic here isn't going away. One player's week of decisions made the other player's name worth more in a marketing conversation than it was 7 days earlier. That's one of the stranger outcomes of a strange week, and it's the kind of thing that sticks around in the background of both of their careers long after the specific details of the fouls and the social media posts have faded from anyone's active memory. Stepping back from the specific details of fouls and social media posts and brand speculation for a moment, the clearest picture of where things currently stand is this. One player is dealing with a situation that is actively getting worse while she's still in the middle of it, and the tools she has available to stop the slide are more limited now than they were a week ago. That's not a comfortable place to be, and the path back to stable ground is longer and harder than a single press conference or a well-worded statement is going to cover. For Carrington, the immediate challenge is separating the basketball from everything else that has attached itself to her name over the past week. She was, by multiple accounts, genuinely playing well before this stretch of games. The Chicago Sky with her in the lineup was a different team than the one that existed before her return, and that story, a player coming back and immediately making her team better, is exactly the kind of narrative a brand can work with during a season. The problem is that narrative has been completely buried under everything that followed, and digging it back out requires the kind of sustained positive run that is hard to maintain when you're still answering questions about two-word social media posts in every press availability. The endorsement question is the one with the most immediate financial weight attached to it, but it's also the one where Carrington has the least control right now. Whether Reebok follows through on reports of cutting ties, or whether the situation is allowed to cool naturally, and the contract remains technically active for the time being. Either way, the relationship between this athlete and this brand has been changed by this week in ways that will be factored into any future conversations about renewals, extensions, or additional campaigns. Brands have long memories for these situations, even when they don't make public statements about them. And the internal conversations that happened in Reebok's marketing department during the past week will be referenced the next time anyone at that company sits down to talk about this partnership. The Sophie Cunningham replacement angle adds a specific kind of pressure that would not exist if Reebok were simply considering dropping Carrington in favor of some other athlete nobody had heard of. The fact that it's Cunningham's name being floated means every time anyone reports on the story, both names appear in the same sentence, and the context of that sentence is one is going up while the other is going down. That framing, repeated across enough coverage for enough days, starts to feel like a verdict even before any formal decision has been made or announced by anyone in an official capacity. There's also a league-level conversation happening in the background of all of this that has implications beyond just these two players. The WNBA has been navigating a genuinely important period in its history, one where expanded audience interest and increased media coverage have created both opportunity and heightened scrutiny simultaneously. Players and officials within the league have been vocal about wanting the conversation to stay focused on basketball, on the quality of the game, on the records being broken, and the matchups worth watching. The Carrington story pulled in exactly the opposite direction, generating headlines that had nothing to do with the quality of play on the court and everything to do with off-court behavior and political language at the worst possible moment for a league trying to capitalize on a surge of mainstream attention. That context matters because it means Carrington isn't just dealing with the judgment of a brand's marketing team. She's dealing with a broader institutional frustration from people within the league who watched a week's worth of positive WNBA stories get overshadowed by a controversy that didn't need to grow as large as it did. That frustration might not be expressed publicly in stark terms. Leagues and teams are careful about how they discuss player behavior in official statements, but it exists, and it shapes the environment a player operates in for the remainder of a season. The question of what happens next is genuinely open. Sports stories like this one follow a few predictable paths. Sometimes the noise dies down, the season moves forward, a player has a dominant stretch of games that generates a different set of headlines, and the story from the bad week gets pushed far enough down the news cycle that it stops being the first thing people associate with that name. That happens. It requires time and a consistent run of undeniable performance, but it is a real path back to stable ground that players have walked before in similar situations. The other path is that the story keeps adding chapters. Each new development, a formal Reebok announcement, a league suspension, another incident on the court, Another comment that generates its own round of coverage, extends the news cycle further and makes the rebuild harder. Which path this particular story takes depends almost entirely on what happens next. And what happens next depends almost entirely on decisions that are still being made in real time by everyone involved. What's already settled, regardless of how the remaining chapters unfold, is that this week will be part of how Dijonai Carrington's career gets discussed for a significant stretch of time going forward. Whether it ends up being a footnote in a longer story of redemption and recovery, or something with more lasting weight, that part is still being written. But the week itself is already locked in. And one bad week, it turns out, can do a lot more than most people ever expect until they're watching it happen live. Here's what this entire story really comes down to when you cut through all the noise. Endorsement deals are not won on skill alone, they are lost on character, and they are lost fast. Carrington had real equity, a real platform, and a real opportunity to be one of the faces of a growing league at the exact moment that league was reaching its largest audience ever. And somewhere in the span of 1 week, the decisions piled up in a direction that no PR team can easily reverse once the momentum is already running the other way. The Reebok situation, whether it resolves the way the reports suggest or takes a different shape entirely, is really just the measurable surface of something deeper. Sports doesn't just sell skill anymore. It sells character, and the camera doesn't blink. What happens next for both players is the question worth watching, because this story is far from finished.